On the morning of August 1st, 1966, shots ring out from the observation deck of the clock tower on the University of Texas campus. It marks the infamous beginning of the modern era of mass shootings in America.
I'm Sarah Ferris, true crime podcaster.
And I'm Katherine Schweit, the former head of the FBI's active shooter program.
And you're listening to Stop the Killing.
This is Katherine Schweit. I'm here with Sarah Ferris for another episode of Stop the Killing, and we're happy that you joined us today. We have a discussion I think that you will find fascinating because it's one that you don't really hear, which is law enforcement officers talking about the challenges to carrying a gun and firing a gun and the decisions that they have to make. I'd like to talk a little bit about civilians carrying guns and just kind of roll those two thoughts together to see, because we're all people carrying guns, making decisions. And so today we are so honored to have on the show our good friend, Jerri Williams, who, like me, was in the FBI, but she was in for 26 years, mostly in Philadelphia, 24 of her 26 years in Philly. So she is a Philly gal for sure.
Definitely.
But Jerri, welcome to Stop the Killing. We're so thrilled to have you here. Jerri has her own podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I've been the host and producer of FBI Retired Case File Review for more than 8 years. I started in January of 2016. And on the podcast, I exclusively interview FBI retirees, usually agents, but also have had some wonderful professional support staff on. And we review a case or an FBI program. And I will be posting my 315th episode later on tonight. I don't know when this is coming out, but yeah, the show's been running now for many years and having a fabulous time showing everyone who the FBI is and what the FBI does.
I love that. It's something that so often people say, well, what's it like to be in the FBI? You want to know what that's like? Listen to Jerri's podcast. And she has talked to many agents who have been in firefights or avoided firefights, gunfights, you would call them. And so she brings a beautiful expanse of views about how we've dealt with this over the years and our own deadly force policy. That's what it's called, the deadly force policy. So we're thrilled to have Jerri on today to talk specifically about what does that mean, deadly force policy, when a law enforcement officer makes a decision to pull a gun. Then how does an officer make a decision to fire or not fire a gun? And that's called a deadly force policy. Every police department has one. Federal, state, local, tribal law enforcement officers have them. All the departments have similarities in their policies, but there are nuances to different policies, and every community and law enforcement officer has its own kind of word version of it. But we're going to talk about the FBI's version today, which is pretty similar to what you would see in others, just because we're going to compare it with some stories about FBI shoots and the challenges that come with doing that. So welcome, Jerri. That's my real welcome. Welcome, Jerri.
Why, thank you. When I got the invitation from you and Sarah about coming on the show, I thought to myself, what can I bring that will add to your show and give value? And the first thing that I thought about was that whenever I go to speak to a group, especially if they're children, the first thing they ask is, have you ever been shot or have you ever shot anyone?
That does not surprise
luckily,
me.
And I say luckily because taking a life is just an unbelievable thing. Even if you are in the right and you're doing it for all the right reasons, it's still, I cannot imagine what that must mean to anyone that has had to do that. So I'm very fortunate to be able to say, no, I've never shot anybody and I have never been shot. But I have been throughout my career in those situations where my gun is out of the holster.
Yep.
I haven't had to make a decision, but when you
Mhm.
go into a house and to make an arrest, your guns are out of the holster. And in an arrest situation, you've got to be on the ready. You don't know what's going to happen behind the door. I was a fraud investigator. I worked Ponzi schemes and embezzlement and things like that. But as I always stress to people who are interested in coming to the FBI, just because that's going to be your assignment or that's the area you want to work in, you are a body. And if the FBI needs a body to go someplace and you're there, then you go. So I have been on many, many arrests. I was assigned for about 3 or 4 years in our Cherry Hill office out of Philadelphia, and that covered Camden. And it was during a time when Camden was one of the biggest drug markets in the country and one of the murder capitals. And I went on every single major drug arrest, or search warrant that they had. So, yeah, I've been placed in those situations many, many times. And so, yeah, I really was interested in talking about this topic.
I think that it's something that probably people like where Sarah lives in the UK, in London, they don't experience on a regular basis and maybe don't I ever dissect, I would guess, right, Sarah?
Well, that's interesting because I just finished editing an episode that we've done with the retired Scotland Yard homicide detective Stephen Keogh, which will be coming out before this. So hop back in the feed and have a look. He was speaking about how it's not a decision that he had to make. He didn't even carry a weapon at all the entirety of his career. And I asked him if he had to carry a weapon and knew that was part of his job to possibly have to pull a weapon on someone, if that would have changed his career path. And yeah, well, you'll have to tune in to see what he says. But I want to ask him that question. Cliffhanger, ladies, cliffhanger, we love it. But I want to ask that question to you, Katherine, as well. Have you ever had to pull your weapon on anyone?
Oh, yes. I mean, I've pulled my weapon on people because that is, as Jerri was just saying, there are many occasions when a law enforcement officer has to have their gun out. Have I ever had to pull a gun out and return fire because I was afraid somebody was going to shoot me? No, I've never been shot and I've never fired at anyone. And that is probably a common experience for most law enforcement officers. And we certainly know it is for most FBI agents. And
Right.
Jerri mentioned talking to kids. That is the first thing that kids always ask you. I so concur in what you just said, Jerri. When kids would ask me, I would always answer that question. And then I would say, my job as an FBI agent is to arrest people and take them to court so that judges and juries can decide whether or not they did something wrong. So if I have to shoot somebody, probably we kind of did something, wrong earlier on. Maybe we might have been able to do something before that to avoid a shooting. You can't always avoid a shoot and you don't invite it. You just have to be prepared when it happens, and you have to be very skilled for that. And so we do a lot of training for that. And I've given so much thought to the idea of if I did have to shoot and kill somebody. And there were people, I'm sure, Jerri, in your class, there were in my class, there were 2 people in my class who chose to step aside because they decided after all the training they did not want to be in a position where they might have to kill another human being.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't think there was anybody in my class that left because of that, but I have certainly heard of people who didn't get the memo when they were recruited. And once they got to Quantico and they had that gun in their hands and they were doing the training, they realized, I thought I could do it, but this is not for me.
Our firearms trainers at Quantico were very supportive of that. And they would say that often. They would say, as we go through this, if you think you cannot do this, we're fine with that. We will find another job for you in the FBI to make sure that you have a career that you find fulfilling. We want you to be comfortable going to this spot because it's also important to the agents around you that you are able to protect them if they need your firepower. And I always remembered that. I would always go to the gym. I always tried to stay strong because I knew that if I was in a firefight, if somebody was near me and they got hit, I would have to use my strength to pull a 180-pound guy out of harm's way, behind the wall or behind the car where I was. And the only way to do that was to stay strong. And I always thought about that. So you prep for it, but I was never in one either. No.
Yeah.
Gun out a lot, though, just like Jerri said. Action is faster than reaction. And my second week in the FBI, a tactical team came through and said, "Hey, can you come with us? We need to go arrest this guy who's wanted for murder." And I was clearing a stairwell with my gun out, the second week in the FBI.
Thinking to yourself, oh my God, this is just like on TV.
I know. Back to back with another agent behind me. We're going up the stairs one step at a time with our guns out. It's just like on TV. Right.
Yeah. And
they really do that.
It is amazing, when you're a new agent and you are in those situations that you realize, wow, this is real. And I don't think you ever get used to it.
Yeah.
Maybe not you might not be thinking about it as you're actually going up the stairwell. But when you get home that night, you're thinking like, wow, people watch this on TV, but this is reality. This is my reality.
And I think in all seriousness, I think it's something that maybe, and thankfully maybe, the public in general doesn't appreciate the gravity of it. When a law enforcement officer leaves, right, for work, it's a different story than when you leave for your job in almost every other job.
I want to ask Sarah.
Yeah.
What do you think, Sarah? Would you have been able to do this job? Do you think you would have been able to carry a gun and go on arrest?
Well, Jerri, there's a fair few steps to get there that I've missed already, isn't there? I'd like to think I could. But I would love to know if it's a moment when you're going through your training where that reality comes kind of crashing down. Because I think, yes, maybe I could. Yes, I could. But I think there's probably going to be a point through that training when I go, ooh, this is really heavy. Like this might actually have to happen for me. But to be honest, I think we've established that I'd make a terrible law enforcement person because I'm quite reactive and don't think things through slowly and calmly first. As Katherine witnessed when we were at CrimeCon in London and I broke up a fight of young teenage boys without even blinking twice. And I get back to the table and I'm like, come on, FBI table. And she like, Sarah, I've just learned to be a really good witness. And I'm like, oh, that's why I'm not.
Oh, yeah. She's like over at a table full of boys who are getting up. They're like standing up. They're going to go after it.
Yeah.
They're like, some of them are running out of the building. Some are coming in and Sarah's in the middle doing like, hey, everybody break it up.
I was like literally putting them on the naughty step. So yeah. So I think the answer to that, Jerri, is I'd like to think I could, but I probably can't. In all honesty, I think it's
that's where
amazing.
that's where the training comes in too. So maybe once you got into training and you learned from also, experience, that it would have been something that you would have been able to do. But you have to know yourself, and definitely if you have doubts, then don't go into law enforcement. We don't even need people that doubt themselves.
Yeah. No, because it's such a momentous responsibility. I think that when you come in and you can take a life or prevent somebody from taking another life, you can save a life. It is a big responsibility and you have to appreciate the gravity of it every moment that you're working, because when you carry a gun, civilian or not, when you carry a gun, you're always in a position where you could end a life. And it might be yours. I was a single mom raising 2 kids. I would go to work and think, I hope I make it back home, or these kids are going to have to move to another state to live with their dad. It doesn't just affect you. There is a phrase in law enforcement that has to do with, everybody goes home safe, right? Everybody goes home safe. Mm-hmm. And that's the goal. First goal is go home safe.
And the other part of it is that this gun becomes a part of your body because we wear it every single day. That's the rule. If you're an FBI agent and you're out someplace and somebody says, go with me on an interview, you can't say, oh, I don't have my gun today. You better have it. You wear it like it's, your pants or your shirt or your hat or whatever. It's just part of who you are. And so, you always have it. Going to and during work, many agents wore their gun 24/7, even when they were home with their kids. I didn't do that, but I would say at least 50% of the agents took their gun with them, even when they went to the soccer game or Now, a lot of times if I came home, I came directly from work, yeah, I had it on. But if on a Saturday or a Sunday, most likely I would not have had it with me.
Well, my gun went to amusement parks, movies, church, grocery store.
I
I
was I
felt,
was not that agent.
well, you know, the reason that I was that agent is I think oftentimes I was with my own children and I felt that I had an extraordinary gift of a skill that could save my life and the life of my children. And I wanted to be prepared to use that if
I'm
I
going
needed to.
I'm going to say something very controversial that I might get some flack on, but as a Black female, I was more afraid that if I was in a situation where I
Oh,
had to
yeah.
pull out the gun, that people would not automatically assume that I was law enforcement.
I think that's absolutely
I
true.
think they would for you, but not
Right.
necessarily for me. And so
Absolutely.
to keep my kids and family safe, I did not.
I think that's brilliant and not controversial. That's the reality of what we are in. And two things. One is that if you don't know, FBI agents have no uniform. So we are in civilian clothes all the time. So when an FBI person pulls a gun out, we look just like anybody else, and no one would think that we were law enforcement. That's one thing. The other thing is the reality of what Jerri was just talking about is we have a very well established, sometimes implicit bias, sometimes outward bias, historically about judging people who have guns in their hands that go against people who are not white. I mean, I just want to summarize it that way, which is probably not the most eloquent way to summarize it. And so, because of that historical view in the country, when someone's making a split-second decision, you don't want to be on the wrong side of a split-second decision. And gunfire is such a split-second, millisecond decision. You don't want to be on the side of, oh, I didn't know. And maybe I can give you just an example of that. There was a shooting in Ohio recently. I don't want to provide all the details at this moment because the reports aren't out on what the shoot was. There was a phone call that came into non-emergency saying that there was somebody with a gun in the street. The officer rolled up. You can hear him on the body camera saying, hey, you know, buddy, what's up? And then almost as he's getting out of the car, he's saying this. And then almost at the same time, right after that, you hear one shot ring out. And then you hear the person who shot saying, it's a toy, it's a toy, it's a toy, it's a toy. And it's a young Black male. And so I don't know what, you know, the race to the officer is. It doesn't matter. But the fact of a law enforcement officer, this particular town is reeling from an officer shooting that involved like 4 dozen rounds into a person who was killed. I mean, just a horrible shooting that there's all kinds of repercussions from. And in this town, in this state, they're now dealing with a shooting of it turns out to be a 15-year-old boy who was carrying a toy gun that was not marked like a toy gun. It was black. So now there's this analysis about, did the officer shoot? And of course, not surprisingly, some people are saying, oh, well, they shot him because he was Black. Well, that's part of that whole conversation about what are our biases? How do you make a decision? Which really leads to what we wanted to talk about today, which maybe, Jerri, I'm going too far afield, but just to ask you, maybe could you articulate what a deadly force policy is?
Yeah, I actually looked it up because I don't want to improvise on this. And this has been updated since 2022 because there have been a lot of issues and a lot of things that have happened. And so the Department of Justice updated this May 20th of 2022. And basically it says that deadly force may not be used solely to prevent the escape of a fleeing suspect. Law enforcement officers and correctional officers of DOJ may use deadly force only when necessary. That is, when an officer has a reasonable belief that the subject of such force poses an imminent danger of death or serious physical injury to the officer or to another person. Firearms may not be discharged solely to disable moving vehicles. Firearms may not be discharged at a moving vehicle. It goes on about vehicles, but basically, you can only shoot a gun to save your life or the life of another. Imminent danger.
In the phrase right before imminent danger, when it says only when necessary, can you read that little part again?
Yeah.
Just
It says, use deadly force only when necessary. That is, when the officer has a reasonable belief that the subject of such force poses an imminent danger of death or serious physical injuries.
And those really are being the lawyer here, being the snobby lawyer about it, is those like reasonable belief. There's a lot of case law. There's a lot of interpretation of what that exactly means. Reasonable belief is what you and I and most of the people would reasonably believe. So you can't come up and say, well, I thought, and that's good enough. It has to be, if somebody steps away and looks at the facts, was that a reasonable? So anytime there's a law enforcement officer shoot a firearms discharge, the law enforcement agency or somebody that oversees them does an evaluation of that shoot, and they apply this kind of a standard to say, is it reasonable? So it's not enough for an officer to say, well, I thought this. It's more, would a lot of people think that? Is that reasonable? And then imminent danger is the second part of that. This is not like, I thought he might do something. This is imminent danger. So even in the circumstances, which the body camera that I saw for this shooting in Ohio, which is just out because it just happened, the body camera doesn't show what the young man was doing. And it doesn't really show, of course, what the officer, when he took a weapon out of his holster and when he fired, or what he could see, because you can't see that from this particular shot. But what part of the evaluation in a good shoot or a bad shoot is, did that officer feel that he was, or somebody else was, in imminent danger? That's very standard language in a deadly force policy.
Yeah, a lot of times you hear people say they shot because they feared for their life. Well, what does that mean? That's not good enough. Fear, being afraid is not good enough.
Right.
Imminent danger. You thought you were going to get killed. You thought that he was going to kill that person.
And you had a reasonable belief of that.
Right. Yes.
You're safely locked in your house and you hear somebody outside and you fire outside the house. Are you in imminent danger?
Yeah. I should stress that you thought, because he raised his gun or he put his hand in his jacket or, made some move. That still doesn't make, it's still going to have to be evaluated. But what was it? What happened? What action was taken that made you feel imminent danger?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's a split-second decision. And through our training, we learn, hopefully that muscle memory of how to make that split-second decision. But all of us have gone through those scenarios, and sometimes we're wrong, dead wrong.
Right. Well, it is muscle memory. It is training, but I think it's something that other people, civilians who carry guns, don't necessarily think about. But for law enforcement, we recognize that you can't go backwards. And the reason it's called the deadly force policy is because there's a recognition that law enforcement doesn't shoot to wound. We're trained to shoot to kill, to stop the threat.
To stop the threat.
So there's two things that sort of jumped out about the policy to me. One, that you shoot to kill. I want to put that to the side for a second. But
and we hope not to kill, right? But we're not shooting for hands.
Right.
We're not shooting for hands.
For the kneecap
you're shooting for the middle of the body.
Right.
Yeah,
that's what we're trained.
Right. You're hoping that somebody doesn't die, but we're trained to shoot to the middle of the body. Right.
Yeah. Okay.
How about this? We shoot to stop the threat. And if that means somebody's going to die, then we shoot to stop the threat.
Right.
The other thing that I thought was interesting in that policy, that probably as a civilian and having watched far too much TV, is that you can't use it on a fleeing person to stop someone fleeing a scene, which is often what you do see, isn't it? Sometimes in the movies.
Absolutely.
The wild gunshots being shot into the crowd. I'm like, that just does not seem safe. So
It
that's
is not.
a no-go.
Yeah, it is not.
That's not real people. Okay.
It is
No,
not.
and you know what? In part because it's difficult to fire a gun and it accurately, and it takes a lot of training. And when somebody is moving away from you, your odds of hitting them is further and further away, harder and harder, less successful. And also, you are throwing rounds where that's what we would call it, right? You're throwing rounds. You have no idea where they're ending up. In law enforcement, you're trained to account for every bullet that's discharged from your weapon. So if you are in a street and somebody starts firing at you, law enforcement is thinking not only about firing, even if they're subconsciously thinking, you're not only thinking about you're discharging 3 rounds at this person, you recognize that those rounds may go through that person and hit another person behind them. Or you may miss your target altogether and it's going to hit and kill somebody behind them. Law enforcement has to worry about that every time they discharge a weapon.
Wow. There's
And
so many.
we should also say that when the shooting review team looks at a matter, it may not have anything to do with anybody being shot. It has to do with the discharge of your weapon. They're looking to see if that deadly force policy was followed even when no one was hit or killed.
Yep. Our analysis is if you discharged a weapon, we want to know if they were justified in doing that under policies and procedures the department has, in our case, the FBI. And if it isn't, you're going to be disciplined for it or even dismissed, right? I mean, you must only discharge a weapon for that reason. And so it's a very high bar to discharge a weapon. When I first started, we were issued 6-hour 226s.
Yeah.
And those are 9mm. And Sarah, I know this is exactly, the details that you need.
You're using numbers as well, which is really helping, me in numbers.
But the later they were issued Glocks, the Glocks have plastic frames, but the 6 hours have metal. I used to say to people, shooting's so complicated. If I really need to use my weapon, I might just hit somebody with it instead of just firing it, because you don't want to discharge a weapon unless you really have to. I appreciate so much that you took the time to go back and pull some clips from some of your interviews. It was very generous of you, particularly because understanding what somebody who's had to discharge their weapon and then get shot at or kill people is such a weight. So it's wonderful that you got them to open up a little bit and help us understand what it's like. Maybe we could just start with Craig's clip, maybe? What do you think?
Yeah. So Craig Arnold, it was episode 263, and I can't remember if he was in New York or North Jersey, but they were working with a cooperator, with an informant, doing some type of a buy situation. And they were in the other room watching everything, seeing when the exchange went down, and then they were going to arrest the subject. And during the transaction in the other hotel room, the subject pulls out a gun and is going to shoot their cooperator. And Craig is able to come through the door of the adjoining rooms and shoot the subject. And he died.
So before we play the clip, I would just want to add that when anybody in law enforcement is working with a cooperating witness, or when we're with a civilian, it is our responsibility to protect the life and safety of that person.
Absolutely.
That is our highest priority in those scenes. Even if it means you let the bad guy go, that's fine. Your job is to protect an unarmed civilian who is with you to help you to accomplish your job. So I'm sure that in Craig's situation, he realized immediately that he was responsible for the safety of that individual, and that he recognizes, as any law enforcement officer would, that you've put them at risk and putting them in this room. Now you must act as quickly and as efficiently as you can to make sure that that person in that other room is safe.
Right. They have a video on their informant. They can hear what's going on. And as soon as he realizes the person is not safe, he is acting. He is making that action. And actually, that video of what happened is out on the internet. And I have it listed in the show notes for his episode, which is episode, I think I already said this, but 263, and he talks about shooting incidents. And he also was awarded several FBI medals of honor. And I think he might have been one of the people that have had a large number of FBI medals of honor because of his actions. But he really talks about what it feels like to have to take a life to save a life. And I think that is what we should really stress today, that, he wasn't going around and beating his chest and all excited about what happened that day. I'm sure he had moments where he really had to think about what happened and then keep telling himself that he took a life to save a life.
So let's hear what Craig has to say in his own words.
I know our guy didn't have a gun, and when I heard the shot was fired, I knew something bad happened. My partner and I initiated our entry, opened the door, pushed it open. I drew my Sig Sauer P220 45 caliber in a shoulder rig. As I'm coming to the door, pushing it open, I'm reaching for my weapon and drawing it. And right in front of me, who do I see is the subject. He had just let another round go, which fortunately missed the cooperating witness. And then he hears me coming through the door. And in slow motion, I see him turning toward me with his weapon to engage me. I'm thinking to myself, you better be quick about this or something bad's going to happen to you and the source. Fortunately, I was able to draw my weapon quickly. I shot him 4 times with a 45 caliber weapon. He went down on my feet. As we say, he was dead right there.
Wow.
That's just the reality of what it's like to do this job. And that's what you see on TV, but that's a very rare occurrence. And when it happens, a law enforcement officer can't hesitate. And you could hear him saying that. He was thinking, and I'm sure in that slow motion in his head, I have to act as fast as I possibly can.
Right. Right.
I mean, you hear how that incident ends, but how does it end for Craig afterwards? What sort of support is available to the FBI once they've, or any law enforcement?
He talks about in this particular episode, he was so grateful that when they took his gun, because they have to take the gun, they're doing a review, a shooting review, so they have to take the weapon, that immediately a supervisor gave him his weapon because he didn't want it to feel like they were saying, I'm taking your weapon because you've done something wrong. And so I think he really appreciated. I'm trying to make sure I didn't get the different interviews that I've done mixed up, but I'm pretty sure that was Craig who talked about how a relief that simple act of kindness was to help his mind start to understand that his actions, were necessary and that he did the right thing.
That's FBI policy, that your gun has to go in for ballistics because there's going to be an investigation for whether it's a good shoot. But we also remove anybody who was involved in the shooting from the scene because we're worried about their care also, recognizing that it's going to sink in what they just did. And it is our policy that we hand a weapon back to an agent if they're in a position to take a weapon back. And part of that is just what Jerri mentioned. It's the idea that we're knowing that you might have had to have done something that was required. That part of what Jerri said before, which is so well articulated, this is a gun is part of your body. It's part of your equipment. And to suddenly have an empty holster would be pretty jarring. And for days on end to have an empty holster as an agent when you're still required to work would be pretty jarring.
And are you still required to work? Is there no kind of, I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, they're not sending you right back out on the street that very second, right? But you're still on duty and an agent is on duty all the time. An FBI agent's on duty 24 hours a day.
Wow, it seems like quite a monumental thing to just then, as we say over here, keep calm and carry on.
Yeah, Jerri, you're throwing me back into the trauma of being an FBI agent.
Yeah.
I forget. Sometimes you forget what a burden it is in its own way.
Yeah, there's lots of things that we took for normal. They were normal for us. That, that most people never even had to think about.
You know, the fact that you answered that question of like, so what's the recovery like, was that the gun going back in the holster was a really important part of it. But I was thinking more along the lines of, do they get to sit down and unpick it with a psychologist or a psychiatrist?
Sure.
They're offered. I don't think it's mandatory, but
some departments it is mandatory because there's, of course, a kind of a big stigma about I don't ever want to talk to anybody. So there are many departments that have put in their policies that when an officer is involved in a shoot, all the officers on the scene have to speak to a psychologist or psychiatrist.
And I do know that the FBI does have a peer program where agents who have been involved in a shoot will talk to or offer to talk to, somebody who has had to shoot someone. I don't know if it's formal, but I do know that they do come together. And again, I learned this from doing these interviews, but I do know that there is a peer program and they do have an opportunity to talk to somebody who's already gone through this, who knows exactly what they're dealing with and what they've gone through.
Well, we had such an insightful conversation with Jerri Williams from the FBI Retired Case File Review podcast and, of course, a retired FBI agent. The depth of her knowledge and the stories she shared were so impactful that we've just had to make this part one of our discussion. Join us for part two, where Jerri will share 3 more gripping and unique clips. Trust me when I say it is a truly impactful episode. In fact, here's a little glimpse of how it impacted Jerri herself.
My hands are cold and clammy, and I'm just thinking about this show and how we may have saved someone's life by giving them this opportunity to hear the realities of what it's like to take a life or to have your life taken in a gun situation.
And if you can't wait for part 2, this is a great opportunity to head over to Apple Podcasts and simply hit the subscribe button to get access to the next episode right now. Or visit us at patreon.com/stopthekilling. Not only will you get ad-free early access and bonus content, but you'll also be supporting our podcast and helping us to continue to bring you this crucial content. Thank you for listening. And as always, the links will be in the show notes and we'll see you in part 2. Thanks for listening. And if you want to know more, Katherine's book, Stop the Killing, is out now. For more details, go to katherineschweit.com. Please consider also supporting our independently made podcast. It's simple to do. Go to patreon.com/Stop the Killing. And for as little as the price of a latte a month, you can be part of the solution to stop the killing. Patreon rewards range from official do-gooder status to ad-free episodes, autographed books, and opportunities to connect with us directly for your business, school, church, or even just a book club chat. But just knowing that you are part of a movement that has the power to make your community safer, well, that's got to taste better than a skinny cappuccino any day. So please head to patreon.com/Stop the Killing now and polish off your do-gooder halo and make sure to include your name so we can give you a shout out. This podcast is a community podcast production. That's con with an N. If you want more content, then head over to Community Podcast at Instagram, where you'll find trailers on more binge-worthy true crime, like the award-winning podcast Conning the Con. And check out our show notes for all the links mentioned. Finally, if you want one takeaway action that you can do right now that can help make our community safer, please share, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen. Everybody needs to know that they hold the keys to see something and say something. Together, we can stop the killing.
It's one of those things you hope never happens, but you better train for it because it will happen, and it will happen in places you wouldn't expect. Be ready for it.